Looking at the brick facade and arched windows of this Amsterdam synagogue, the 17th-century Dutch Republic appears as a quiet beacon of religious tolerance. But the people worshipping inside lived in a state of high alert. This Portuguese Sephardic community was built by conversos, refugees who had survived the Spanish Inquisition by hiding their faith, and who were now desperate to prove to the Dutch authorities that their newly reclaimed Jewish congregation posed no threat to the social order. Among them was a 22-year-old student named Baruch Spinoza. He was a brilliant thinker, raised entirely within the protective, anxious walls of this tight-knit neighborhood. Spinoza was thoroughly embedded in the local establishment. He received a rigorous education at the Talmud Torah school, studying Hebrew grammar and rabbinical commentaries, and worked long hours helping run his late father's importing business. For a population traumatized by forced conversions and executions, survival depended on strict internal conformity. Any deviation from orthodox belief risked drawing the scrutiny of the Dutch state, turning independent thought into an existential threat to the entire congregation. That tension boiled over outside the synagogue. As Spinoza stepped into an alley one evening, an attacker lunged at him with a knife. The assassin aimed for Spinoza's neck, but Spinoza pulled back just in time. The heavy fabric of his winter cloak caught the blade, saving his life. He escaped physically unharmed, and for the rest of his life, Spinoza kept that torn garment hanging in his room as a physical reminder of the lethal weight of ideas. It raises an uncomfortable question. Why would a vulnerable congregation of religious refugees be pushed to the brink of murdering one of their own most promising young scholars? Spinoza survived the knife, but the attack confirmed his private questioning had become an open rebellion, one the community was prepared to suppress with physical force. The rift began when Spinoza's intellectual curiosity pulled him outside the synagogue walls. He hired an ex-Jesuit and radical political thinker named Franciscus van den Enden to teach him Latin, the language of early modern science. This biographical record outlines how van den Enden's school functioned as a hub for radical thought, introducing Spinoza to a network of democratic activists and the scientific methods of Bacon, Galileo, and Descartes. But Spinoza already knew exactly how dangerous it was to ask questions in Amsterdam. When he was just 8 years old, his relative, Uriel da Costa, had been cast out of the Jewish community for denying the immortality of the soul and challenging the divine revelation of the Torah. As a condition to be readmitted, da Costa was forced to lie down at the threshold of the synagogue where the congregation stepped over him. Humiliated and broken by the ordeal, he took his own life days later. Da Costa's fate demonstrated the crushing psychological cost of theological control. Rather than intimidating Spinoza into silence, the tragedy cemented his resolve to systematically dismantle the superstitions used to govern human lives. By his early 20s, Spinoza shared 3 distinct conclusions. The soul dies with the body, Mosaic laws are not binding, and God is not personal. Instead, he formulated the concept of immanence. God is not an architect looking down from above, but is entirely identical to the physical fabric and interlocking laws of nature itself. On July 27, 1656, the Jewish Council retaliated. They gathered before the Holy Scrolls and issued a herem, the most severe and absolute writ of excommunication in their history. Looking at the official record of the pronouncement, the vitriol is explicit. The council decreed that they excommunicate, expel, curse, and damn Baruch de Spinoza. The order permanently banned anyone from communicating or doing business with him, or coming within 4 cubits. Spinoza absorbed the news with complete calm. He packed his belongings and left, noting simply that the council had forced him to do what he would have eventually done on his own. The severity of the curse backfired. By stripping away his religious identity, his inheritance, and his social network, the council inadvertently freed him from all communal obligations, forging the first truly secular individual of the modern era. Cut off from his past, Spinoza moved to The Hague. He supported his philosophical writing by working as a master lens grinder for microscopes and telescopes, a manual labor dedicated to achieving absolute clarity of vision. He lived quietly until 1672, when political chaos consumed the Dutch Republic. A frenzied royalist mob targeted the Republican leaders, Johan and Cornelius de Witt, dragged them into the street, and brutally lynched them. Repulsed by the crowd's savagery, Spinoza painted a wooden placard with the words Ultimi Barbarorum, the lowest of barbarians, and prepared to carry it out to the site of the murders. Knowing the mob would tear the philosopher apart the moment he appeared, his landlord physically locked Spinoza inside his room, keeping him from stepping out into the street. Trapped inside, Spinoza realized that escaping a religious community was not enough. The lynching of the DeWitts proved that a secular mob, whipped into a frenzy by fear and passion, could be exactly as tyrannical as a religious inquisition. This is the title page of the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus. Spinoza published it anonymously in response to the escalating violence, laying out the architecture for a society that could survive human irrationality. In its pages, he invented modern biblical criticism. He argued that Scripture was a historical document, written and compiled by flawed humans over centuries, rather than the literal, infallible dictation of God. By stripping the state of its theological mandates, he arrived at a revolutionary conclusion. The true purpose of a government is not to control its citizens through fear, but to guarantee their freedom to think. The backlash was fierce. Critics demanded the book be banned, with one declaring it forged in hell by the apostate Jew working together with the devil. The hostility was so intense that Spinoza had to intervene and halt its translation into Dutch. Spinoza's response to a torn cloak and a mob's violence was to define a state whose power ends where a citizen's private thought begins, the principle of secular governance that would define democratic life for the next 3 centuries. Working under the constant threat of religious persecution, he secretly composed what would become his masterpiece, the Ethics. The Ethics does not read like a standard philosophical or theological treatise. It is written in the rigid style of a Euclidean geometry textbook, carefully built upon strict definitions, self-evident axioms, and step-by-step mathematical propositions. Spinoza used this mathematical format to confront a difficult paradox. If every event in the universe is the necessary result of a previous cause, the very nature of human freedom must be re-examined. He intended this geometric system to serve as a technical map for the human mind, a way to identify the physical and psychological causes of suffering and move past them. Spinoza's geometric proof begins with a radical premise known as substance monism. He argues that there is exactly one infinite, self-caused substance in the entire universe. He calls this single substance Deus sive natura, God, or nature. This God has no personality, no will, and no moral judgment. It does not issue commandments, formulate plans, or answer prayers. This text analyzing Spinoza's first axiom outlines the logical trap. All things must exist either in themselves or in something else. Further down, it clarifies God's existence depends on nothing but itself, a causa sui. Because an infinite regress of causes is impossible, everything that exists is either the one independent substance, God, or a dependent modification of it. God does not stand outside the universe pulling the strings. God is the strings, the absolute, invariable laws of cause and effect governing all phenomena. If we are all simply modifications of nature, completely embedded in its causal web, then our belief that we make independent, uncaused choices is an illusion born of ignorance. We are conscious of our desires, but blind to the causes that determine them. Accepting this absolute determinism requires a total shift in how we view human psychology. We are not an independent kingdom within a kingdom. We are tiny, finite modes within nature, subject to the exact same physical laws as a rock or a river. The biological engine driving us is the kenosis, the innate striving of every entity to persevere in existence. Our kenosis fluctuates. When external forces align with our nature and increase our power, we experience joy. When the environment compresses our power, we experience sadness. The problem is that most of us live in a state of passivity. We are constantly tossed around by external environmental forces, developing confused, inadequate ideas about why things happen, and suffering through turbulent emotional ups and downs that Spinoza labels as passions. Human suffering, then, is not the result of sin or a weak moral character. It is a mechanical consequence of being a vulnerable part of a massive causal machine we do not fully comprehend. Spinoza's solution is highly counterintuitive. True freedom is not the ability to do whatever you want. Freedom is achieving a rational understanding of necessity, seeing exactly how and why you are determined by the laws of cause and effect. To reach this freedom, the mind must ascend through 3 levels of knowledge. It begins at raw imagination, governed by random sensory experience and superstition, and moves up to reason, which understands the common physical properties of things. This page details how those stages map to our existence. The first kind of knowledge occurs when affected blindly by finite modes. The second uses reason to grasp infinite modes. The third allows us to grasp things as modifications of divine attributes. This highest peak of understanding is scientia intuitiva, or intuitive knowledge. When a person reaches this state, they understand the eternal essence of things, which necessarily generates the highest possible joy, the intellectual love of God. This intellectual love brings profound psychological peace. By understanding that everything, including our own pain, our personal failures, and our limitations, follows necessarily from the eternal laws of nature, we stop fighting the universe and joyfully accept our exact place within its geometry. True liberation is found in the rational understanding of the machine's inner workings. Spinoza did not live to see the impact of his geometric blueprint. He died peacefully in his rented room in The Hague in February 1677, his lungs ruined by the glass dust from the lenses he ground to support himself. His magnum opus remained unpublished. Knowing the extreme danger, his close circle of friends immediately gathered the manuscripts from his desk. They shipped them to Amsterdam, rapidly printing and distributing the texts as the opera postuma. The backlash was swift and overwhelming. Both secular magistrates and religious synods recognized the threat of a philosophy that erased a personal God, and they moved aggressively to crush the text and halt its distribution. By 1678, his works were banned throughout Holland, joining a long tradition of institutional censorship. Books that challenged divine authority were routinely placed on prohibited indices to protect the public from supposedly blasphemous and atheistic propositions. Condemned across Europe as a monstrous atheist, his name became a synonym for heresy. Yet the logical architecture of his philosophy was simply too mathematically precise to be erased by decrees. More than a century later, during the pantheism controversy of 1780s Germany, his ideas were accidentally brought back into the light. Romantic thinkers rediscovered his work, transforming him from a despised outcast into an intellectual hero. Spinoza's vision of a strictly determined, rationally knowable universe eventually laid the philosophical groundwork for modern physics, capturing the imagination of scientists like Albert Einstein. When asked if he believed in a higher power, Einstein famously replied that he believed in Spinoza's God, a deity that reveals itself in the orderly harmony of what exists, not in a creator who concerns himself with the fates of human beings. The cultural vindication reached a symbolic peak in 1927 at Mount Scopus in Jerusalem. There, scholars gathered to formally celebrate his legacy, effectively overturning the harsh excommunication that had cast him out of his community centuries earlier. Spinoza stripped the universe of its miracles, its divine judgments, and its human-like creator. But in doing so, he didn't destroy meaning. He provided the timeless architecture for true intellectual freedom, proving that to understand the absolute necessity of nature is to find lasting, unshakable joy.